Dr. Sarah Chen wiped the sweat from her brow, the Illinois sun beating down mercilessly on the archaeological dig site. It was the summer of 2025, and her team had been excavating near Cahokia Mounds for 3 months, searching for evidence of pre-Mississippian cultures in the American Midwest. Dr. Chen, you need to see this. Marcus, her graduate assistant, was on his knees at the edge of Trench 7, his brush frozen mid-stroke. Sarah hurried over, her heart racing with the familiar thrill of discovery. What she saw made her breath catch. Bones. Not just any bones, a complete skeleton, curled in a fetal position, surrounded by artifacts unlike anything she'd ever seen. But it was the skeleton itself that drew her eye. The bones had a strange, almost luminescent quality in the afternoon light, and they were decorated with intricate carvings that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed from different angles. Carbon dating, Sarah whispered, already knowing this was something extraordinary. Get me a sample. Now. 3 days later, the results came back. Sarah read the report 3 times, certain there had been a mistake. 7,000 years old, give or take a century. That was impossible. The accepted timeline of human habitation in the Americas didn't support sophisticated burial practices that far back, not in this region. And the artifacts buried with the skeleton, obsidian tools that couldn't have originated within 1,000 miles, copper ornaments that predated known metallurgy in North America, and something else. A collection of small bones arranged in a circle around the skull, each carved with symbols that made Sarah's eyes hurt when she tried to focus on them. There's something else, Marcus said, his voice unsteady. He handed her a small object, recently cleaned. It was a medallion made of some dark metal she couldn't identify, suspended on a cord of braided sinew that had somehow survived millennia. It was around the neck. And Sarah, I've been having dreams since we found this. Bad dreams. Sarah took the medallion, fighting the urge to drop it immediately. It was cold, impossibly cold, and seemed to pulse with a rhythm like a heartbeat. Against her better judgment, she slipped it into her pocket. That night, the dreams began. Sarah stood in a landscape she didn't recognize. The Mississippi River was there, but wider, wilder, surrounded by forests so dense they seemed to swallow the horizon. The air tasted different, cleaner, charged with something electric and alive. A settlement sprawled before her, but not like any Native American village she'd studied. The structures were massive, built of stone and wood in architectural styles that predated known civilizations. Towers reached toward the sky, their surfaces covered in the same shifting symbols she'd seen on the bones. People moved through the settlement, and Sarah realized with a shock that she could understand their speech, though the language was like nothing she'd ever heard. Ancient, primal, composed of sounds that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce. The keeper comes, a woman said, pointing toward the horizon. She was tall, her skin painted with mineral dyes that glowed faintly in the twilight. The boundary grows thin. Will the sacrifice hold? A man asked. He wore the same dark medallion Sarah now possessed, and she understood with dream logic certainty that he was the skeleton, alive 7,000 years ago. It must, the woman replied. If the keeper breaks through, if the old ones return, this world will become as the world before, a feeding ground, a garden of screaming souls. The vision shifted. Sarah saw a ceremony, hundreds of people gathering around a massive pit that seemed to descend into impossible depths. At the edge stood the man with the medallion, the future skeleton. He was young, perhaps 20, and tears streamed down his face. I accept, he said in that strange language. I accept the binding.
They lowered him into the pit alive.
Sarah tried to look away but couldn't. She watched as they sealed him in with stones, watched as he carved symbols into his own bones with an obsidian knife, watched as he arranged the smaller bones, children's bones, she realized with horror, in a protective circle around his head.
The boundary will hold,
the woman chanted. The keeper will sleep. The sacrifice is eternal. But then the man spoke one last time, his voice echoing up from the sealed tomb. 7,000 years. When the bones are disturbed, the binding breaks. Someone must take my place or the keeper wakes. Sarah jolted awake, gasping, the medallion burning cold against her chest. She hadn't remembered putting it on, but there it was, hanging around her neck. The cord somehow lengthened to fit her, and she could hear something. A voice, distant but growing closer, speaking in that same impossible language. The binding breaks. I am awake. The next morning, Marcus didn't come to the dig site. Sarah called his apartment, no answer. She drove there, using the spare key he'd given her for emergencies. The apartment was empty, but something was wrong. The air felt thick, contaminated. On the wall, written in what looked disturbingly like blood, were the same symbols from the bones. And on the floor, arranged in a careful circle, were Marcus's clothes, his phone, his wallet, everything except Marcus himself. Sarah's phone rang. Unknown number. Dr. Chen. The voice was Marcus's, but wrong, layered, multiple voices speaking in unison. The keeper thanks you for freeing it. It has been so long since it walked between the spaces. Where's Marcus? What have you done with him? Marcus is here. Marcus is everywhere. Marcus is the first meal in 7,000 years. The voice laughed, and the sound made Sarah's ears bleed. But one graduate student is not enough. The keeper hungers. The old ones hunger. They remember this world, this garden. They want to come home.
The line went dead.
Sarah ran back to her car, her mind racing. The medallion pulsed against her chest, and with each pulse she understood more. The civilization in her dreams hadn't been destroyed by natural causes or war. They'd been farmers, human farmers, for something older and more terrible than she could comprehend. Beings that existed in the spaces between reality, that fed on suffering and fear. 7,000 years ago, one man had volunteered to become a living seal, using his own death and eternal consciousness to hold a boundary between worlds. The circle of children's bones had been the price, the power source for the binding. And now that she'd disturbed the grave, removed the artifacts, the binding was breaking. She drove to the university library, searching for any reference to similar myths. What she found chilled her to the bone. Every culture had stories of boundary keepers, of sacrifices that held back the dark. The Babylonians, the Mayans, the Chinese, the Egyptians, all of them had legends of sealed places that must never be opened, of bones that must never be disturbed. The archaeological record was full of graves like the one she'd found. Unusual burials, bodies positioned strangely, artifacts that didn't fit the timeline. What if they were all the same? What if every few thousand years, as the binding weakened, someone had to take the place of the previous keeper? Sarah looked down at the medallion. She understood now what it was, a key and a collar. Whoever wore it could take on the binding, could become the new seal. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Come to the mounds at midnight. Bring the key, or everyone dies. Sarah stood at Cahokia Mounds as the sun set, the medallion heavy around her neck. She'd brought everything from the grave, the artifacts, the carefully preserved bones, even the small bones of the children. She'd brought something else too, gasoline and matches. If she couldn't seal the keeper, maybe she could burn the connection. But as midnight approached, she began to feel the wrongness spreading. The sky above the mounds rippled like water. Stars appeared that weren't on any chart, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. The air grew thick and sweet with the smell of rot and honey. And then she saw them. They came from nowhere and everywhere, shapes that her mind struggled to process. Some looked almost human, tall and pale with too many joints in their limbs. Others were just shadows, but shadows with teeth and eyes. And at the center of them all was something massive, the keeper. It wore Marcus's face like a mask, but the body beneath was wrong. Too tall, too thin, with skin that seemed to be made of crawling insects. When it spoke, every voice she'd ever heard echoed in its words. The boundary is broken, the old ones return. This world remembers us even if you do not. We were here first. We were here always. You are the interlopers, the weeds in our garden. The binding, Sarah started, can be renewed, the keeper finished. One life, freely given, sealed in the earth with the old bones and the old words. 7,000 years of consciousness, of holding the door closed with nothing but will and sacrifice. Are you brave enough? Are you foolish enough? Sarah looked at the medallion in her hand, then at the sky full of wrong stars, then at the shapes gathering on the mounds, more of them every second, pressing against reality like insects against a window. She thought about Marcus. She thought about every person in the world living their lives completely unaware of how thin the walls of reality really were. She thought about the young man 7,000 years ago, climbing into his tomb, carving symbols into his own bones, accepting an eternity of imprisonment to save everyone he'd ever known. If I do this, Sarah said slowly, how do I know it will hold? You don't, the keeper replied. The last binding held 7,000 years. Perhaps yours will hold longer, perhaps shorter. Perhaps someone will dig you up in 1,000 years and start this all over again. That is the nature of boundaries. They require constant maintenance. And if I refuse? The keeper smiled with Marcus's face. Then we feast, then we spread. Then this world becomes what it was meant to be, a garden for the old ones. Every human will become a meal that lasts for centuries. We eat slowly, we eat carefully, we make it last. Sarah closed her eyes. She thought about her parents, her friends, her students. She thought about children playing in parks, lovers kissing, elderly couples holding hands. She thought about every ordinary, beautiful moment of human existence. She thought about 7,000 years of darkness and pain, of holding a door closed against things that wanted nothing more than to destroy everything she loved. Tell me how to begin the binding, Sarah said. The keeper, still wearing Marcus's face, laughed. Brave little human, foolish little human, come. It led her to the original excavation site, to Trench 7 where the skeleton had been found. But now the trench was deeper, much deeper, descending into the earth far beyond what they'd excavated. Stone steps led down into darkness. This is the old way, the keeper said. The first way. The chamber below was built by the ones who came before you, before even the civilization you dreamed of. They understood the necessity of boundaries. They built this place as a prison, and every few thousand years, it requires a new prisoner. Sarah descended the steps, carrying the bones and artifacts. The medallion grew colder with each step, pulling her forward like a magnet. Behind her, she could feel the keeper and its companions following, a procession of nightmares. The chamber at the bottom was exactly as she'd seen in her dreams. Walls covered in the shifting symbols, a circular pit at the center, and implements she recognized with growing dread. The obsidian knife, the copper chains, the stone ceiling plates. You must speak the words, the keeper instructed, its voice almost gentle now. You must carve the symbols into your own bones while you still live. You must arrange the bones of the previous keeper in a circle of protection. And then you must lie in the pit and accept the sealing. Will it hurt? Sarah asked, her voice surprisingly steady. Every moment of every day for 7,000 years, the keeper replied honestly. Your consciousness will not sleep. You will feel the pressure of the old ones trying to break through, and you will hold them back with nothing but your will. You will go mad 1,000 times over, and each time you must find your sanity again. This is the price of the binding. Sarah looked at the obsidian knife, then at her own hands. What if there was another way? There is no other way. There has never been another way. The old ones are eternal. They cannot be killed, only contained. And containment requires sacrifice. Sarah picked up the knife. It felt alive in her hand, eager. She took a deep breath and made the first cut. The pain was exquisite, beyond anything she'd imagined. But as the blood flowed and she began carving the symbols into her own arm bone, she felt something else. Power. The medallion flared cold against her chest, and suddenly she understood the language of the symbols. They weren't just words, they were math, reality bent and shaped into locks and keys. And she saw a possibility the young man 7,000 years ago had never seen, because he hadn't known what she knew. She was an archaeologist. She understood carbon dating, understood how radioactive decay worked, understood the deep time of the Earth itself. The binding didn't have to be alive. It had to be conscious, yes, but consciousness wasn't the same as life. "You're right," Sarah said, still carving, blood streaming down her arms. "The old ones can't be killed. But what if they could be frozen? What if instead of a living person holding the door, we made the door part of the Earth itself?" She worked faster now, carving symbols not just of binding but of transformation. She arranged the ancient bones not in a circle but in a spiral, a pattern that echoed the structure of DNA, of galaxies, of everything that grew and changed and lived. "What are you doing?" the keeper demanded, and for the first time Sarah heard fear in its voice. "Evolution," Sarah said. 7,000 years ago they didn't have the knowledge. But I do. I know about radiation, about half-lives, about elements that decay over billions of years. I'm not just making a lock. I'm making a lock that powers itself, that grows stronger over time instead of weaker. She plunged the obsidian knife into the ground at the center of the spiral and spoke the words she'd learned from the medallion. But changed, modified, improved with 7,000 Y. "No," the keeper held. "You don't understand. The binding requires consciousness. It requires suffering. That's what they feed on, what keeps them satisfied, knowing that one of your kind suffers eternally to save the rest." "I understand perfectly," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as power flowed through the carved symbols. "You don't want to break through. You want the binding to continue exactly as it has, because the suffering of the keeper is itself a form of feeding. You've been farming us all along. Not by breaking through, but by ensuring that every few thousand years, we sacrifice ourselves to stop you." The medallion shattered around her neck, but instead of falling, the pieces floated into the air, joining with the other artifacts, with the bones, with the very stone of the chamber itself. The spiral Sarah had created began to glow, and she understood what was happening. She wasn't creating a living prison. She was creating a symbiosis. The Earth itself was ancient, far older than humanity, older than the old ones. It had its own slow consciousness, its own deep will, and it had been invaded, hollowed out with chambers like this one, wounded by the presence of things that didn't belong. Sarah's modified binding wasn't a lock at all. It was an immune response. "I'm not going to lie in that pit," Sarah said, her voice echoing with power. "Instead, I'm waking something up, something that's been sleeping since before the old ones arrived, something that was here first." The chamber rumbled. Cracks appeared in the walls, but not from damage, from movement. The stone itself was alive, had always been alive, just operating on a timescale too slow for humans to perceive. And it was angry. The keeper and its companions tried to flee, but they were too late. The stone reached out with slow, inevitable patience and began to seal them away, not in a simple pit, but in pockets distributed throughout the Earth's crust, separated by miles of stone and magma and time. "You've doomed us all," the keeper hissed as the stone closed around it. "The old ones will never stop trying to return. Without a conscious keeper, without the suffering that satisfied their hunger, they'll be starved out," Sarah finished. "That's the point. No more sacrifices. No more 7,000-year cycles. Just slow geological time grinding away at them until they finally give up and go somewhere else." "You can't. I already have." The stone closed completely, and silence fell in the chamber. Sarah stood alone among the bones and artifacts, her arms still bleeding from the symbols she'd carved. But she could feel the change spreading, rippling out through the earth. Everywhere there were similar chambers, similar weak points in the boundary. The earth was waking up and sealing them. It would take time, thousands of years, perhaps tens of thousands. The old ones were patient, and the earth was more patient still. But for the first time in all of human history, The boundary would hold without requiring human sacrifice. Sarah climbed the stone steps back to the surface, emerging into the pre-dawn light. Her phone had dozens of messages, other archaeologists reporting strange seismic activity at dig sites around the world, ancient tombs sealing themselves, artifacts crumbling to dust. The binding was spreading, adapting, learning.
Fed by her knowledge,
By human understanding of geology and chemistry and time, it was becoming something new, something that didn't require suffering to function. Marcus's body was found 3 days later at the base of one of the mounds. He was alive but unconscious, with no memory of what had happened. The doctor said it was a seizure, possibly brought on by exposure to toxic mold at the dig site. Sarah never corrected them. 10 years passed. Sarah became a professor, teaching not just archaeology but what she called deep time studies, understanding human history not as separate from geological history but as part of it. She never forgot the chamber, the keeper, the choice she'd made. Sometimes late at night she could still feel the Earth's slow consciousness, still feel it working patiently to seal away the old ones forever. And sometimes she wondered if she'd really defeated them, or just postponed the problem for future generations. But then she'd remember the young man from 7,000 years ago, willingly climbing into his tomb, accepting an eternity of suffering to buy humanity time. She'd given them something better: knowledge, understanding, and a solution that didn't require anyone to sacrifice themselves. It wasn't a perfect ending. The old ones were still out there, still pressing against the boundaries, still hungry.
but they were no longer
Humanity's burden alone. The Earth itself had taken up the watch, and the Earth was very, very patient. Sarah touched her scarred arms, where the symbols she'd carved had healed into permanent marks. They didn't hurt anymore, but they served as a reminder the boundaries would hold, not because of suffering, but because of understanding. And that, she thought, was a better kind of binding entirely.
the end.